Okay, let's break down the lyrics to the song so that we can understand the passive voice a little bit better. So we have,
it's formed by taking the verb to be, and here comes the difficult bit. It might be in any tense under the sun, and that's just the half of it.
so whenever we use a passive voice, we're going to use the verb to be, but it can be conjugated in any tense. So we have some examples here in the song.
Once you've conjugated your verb to be into words where I wouldn't have been.
Okay, so we might use the verb to be in the past tense, in the future tense, in a conditional tense. The passive voice doesn't refer to any specific time, so the verb to be is the part of the structure that gets conjugated. So we could say, for example, the house is painted, the house was painted, the house will be painted, changing the tense of the verb to be. Okay, so the next part of the song says,
You must add your past participle, such as played, wanted, eaten, or seen.
The passive voice, as I've already mentioned, will always have a verb to be, and it will always have a past participle. When we see the combination of these two structures, what we are using is a passive voice. Okay. As I've mentioned, we can use the passive voice in many different tenses by changing the tense of the verb to be. We can also combine it with modal verbs, and we have to look at the structure in this case.
Then combining this voice with a modal verb, he keeps its infinitive form, and the past participle must be added, as has been previously sworn.
So if you use a modal verb such as can or could or might, you can combine it with the passive voice, and in this case the verb to be will stay in its base infinitive form. So we would end up with things like the house can be painted, the house could be painted, the house might be painted, and we keep be in the infinitive form. Okay, so in the next part of the song we say,
But why would you use this sentence, you ask, which has such an unpleasant sound? Why would you take the subject and object and put them the wrong way round? Sometimes when we talk, we don't know all the facts, and as speakers we have to admit it. We might mention an action that happened, but we're not exactly sure who did it.
so often students have problems with the passive voice because when we translate it into other languages, it sounds a bit strange, and obviously we are changing the order of the words. So why would we mix up the elements of a sentence in this way? So in the part of the song that I just mentioned, often we use the passive voice when we want to talk about an action, but we don't know who did the action. So if I say, for example, the house was painted, I can see that the house has changed color, but maybe I don't know who painted the house, and that's why I decided to use the passive voice. Okay, and so we've got another example in the song.
The bank was robbed, I might hear you say, but you don't know who was the robber.
And then we've got another context where we might use the passive voice here.
Or the subject could be so obvious that to mention it's not worth the bother.
So one context where we might use the passive voice is we might know who the subject is, but it might be so obvious from the context that we don't really need to mention it. So one example that we have in the song.
We say 3 goals were scored during the match, knowing players kicked the ball.
Okay, so in this case, when we are talking about a football match and we talk about the goals that have been scored, we don't need to say that the players scored the goals, because this is very obvious from the context, which is why we use the passive voice in this case. The next part of the song says,
Or the striker will be awarded a prize, as the giver doesn't matter at all.
so this is another context where we might use the passive voice. If we are talking about an action in which the person who receives the action or the action itself is more important or more significant than the person who does the action, then we're going to use the passive voice, because we don't need to mention the subject in this case. Okay. In some contexts, we might use the passive voice, but we may still want to mention who did the action. So how are we going to do that? In the song it says,
If you want to mention the subject or doer, bias the correct preposition. For example, the cake was baked by the chef, or laws were passed by the politician.
so when we use the passive voice, if we wish to mention who did the action, we can use the word by. So we've already mentioned some examples of when we might use the passive voice. If the subject is unknown, if the subject is obvious, or if the subject is unimportant. So in what kinds of contexts is it likely for us to see this structure? Let's listen to what it says in the song.
In translation, these phrases don't always make sense, but in English they're really quite normal, and they're common in scientific report and text, both journalistic and formal.
Often we're going to see the passive voice when we read the news, or often when we are being told about something in which maybe we don't know all of the information, and often when we are describing processes in which the action itself is more important than the person who does the action. For example, if we write a lab report or a scientific text.
Now this useful structure has been